those questions. So with that, Ashley, thank you so much for being here tonight, and looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Awesome. Thank you, Annie. I'd like to thank Annie and the CCA for inviting me to speak tonight, and thank all of you for attending to listen to me. I will be presenting the results of my thesis research. I was a graduate student at New Mexico State University, and I examined the influence of recreational disturbance on desert bighorn sheep behavior and stress in specifically the Dominguez-Escalante National Conservation Area, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So I wanted to first introduce myself a little bit. I grew up in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York, where I have since returned to. But after I graduated from Paul Smith College, I was offered a job with California Department of Fish and Wildlife. There, I worked as a field technician on the Desert Bighorn Sheep Management Program in the Mojave Desert. I spent 4 years out there. I learned the ins and outs of desert bighorn management, and I really loved my time there. However, after a while, I kind of started feeling limited as a field technician. I really wanted to have more of an influence on the management of wildlife species rather than just the monitoring and data collection aspect. And in order to move up in the wildlife biology field, it really helps to have a graduate degree. Luckily, that experience in the Mojave Desert really easily and nicely led into a master's position at New Mexico State University, where I researched desert bighorn. I spent nearly 2 years in the canyons of the Dominguez-Escalante, and I collected my data there, and I really did fall in love with those canyons. After defending my thesis, I did move back to New York because I really missed trees and water after I'd been in the desert for nearly 10 years. And then I most recently, this past fall, took a wildlife biologist position with the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. And in my position, I'm responsible for fur bearer management, and I'm also the hunter education coordinator for my region. But you're here to learn about sheep in these canyons that you love so much, so I'll get into it. So the number of people participating in nature-based outdoor recreation activities on public lands is increasing dramatically. And it isn't just the number of people, but also the time that they spend outdoors, which is often referred to as activity days. And so both of these metrics are really increasing a lot with projected increases into the future. On a broad scale, recreation is considered to be one of the greatest threats to biodiversity in already protected areas. At small scales, recreation impacts wildlife, wildlands, and the recreational experience itself. And because public lands are managed for a wide variety of stakeholders, it's really important to understand what these impacts are. So I really focused on the wildlife aspect for my research. Wildlife often view humans as predators and will react accordingly to their presence on the landscape. And those responses can include stuff like changes in behavior or habitat selection, physiological stress, flight responses, or avoidance of habitat, all of which can contribute to a reduction in fitness or reduction in the ability for these animals to survive and reproduce, making it what seem to be harmless, non-consumptive activities something of a concern. And one of the really important things to understand the impact of the recreation is to be able to quantify the recreation itself, both spatially across the landscape and temporally over time. And this is often an overlooked aspect of management. In a review of a bunch of studies, there was one author who found that over 80% of the studies, including that were studying the impacts of recreation, these studies included recreation as a categorical variable with 3 or fewer levels. So think recreation is considered to be high, medium, and low, regardless of time or location. And this really limits the ability to detect responses of animals at different scales, spatially and temporally. Furthermore, many studies used, if they didn't just lump those into the categories, those studies used proxy measures instead, such as infrastructure density, how many trails per a certain amount of area, permit counts, entrance numbers, and even just sometimes expert opinion to qualify the recreation. But it's really important, and so a big focus on my research on figuring out how to get a more exact and finer scale understanding of the recreation on the landscape. And some studies have had success using remote monitoring methods such as trail cameras and counters. And one study out of Alberta was able to create a model that predicted when recreation would be present on the trail. And I tried to emulate that with my own research. So let's now shift to the specific responses to recreation that I was examining, starting with behavior. Because nutrition and the food that's taken in strongly influences the survival and reproduction of animals, they try to forage in a way that they can meet their daily caloric requirements. However, the threat of predation, of being eaten by something, requires that time and energy be diverted to reduce that risk of predation. And this can really impose a trade-off in which foraging time can be decreased in order to increase the likelihood of daily survival through vigilance. So think of it like this. It's better to be a little bit hungry today than to be a mountain lion snack. But a long-term reduction in energy intake can have corresponding effects on survival and reproduction. Animals mitigate this trade-off a few different ways, but one behavioral response can be through a multitasking behavior where they're processing food, they're taking that bite and they're chewing while they're vigilant and looking around, scanning for predators. Because animals will often view humans as predators, this trade-off has been imposed and observed in other species with regards to recreational disturbance. The other aspect I examined was how these bighorn were, how the recreation influenced their stress levels. So predation risk, again, remember, animals view people as predators or potential predators. Predation risk triggers a stress response in which energy is shifted away from everyday functions such as metabolism, growth, or immune function, and it makes that energy available for emergency functions like flight, like running away. And typically it has relatively minor costs, but chronic stress over a long period of time can have deleterious effects. One of the great things that I used is a method of measuring physiological stress called fecal glucocorticoid metabolites. These are essentially the stress hormones that have been released into the bloodstream after they've been, used to trigger a flight response or a stress response. They're then broken down in the digestive tract of the animal and then deposited in feces. And this is a non-invasive method of measuring stress that doesn't add additional stress on the animal. Another really common way of measuring stress is through blood samples. However, that imposes a lot of stress as you have to catch the animal and prick them with a needle and draw that blood. And so it's going to alter your measurements. One of the downsides of this method is that fecal glucocorticoid metabolites is a delayed measure of stress because of the time it requires for those hormones to go through the metabolic digestive system. So we typically see peaks in the hormone present in the feces about 12 hours after a stress response occurs. So my study really had these three objectives in which we first use a model to predict the motorized and non-motorized recreation on trails in the bighorn habitat, and then use this predicted recreation as a variable in the models of behavior and stress, looking at what those recreation and differing recreations in different parts of the conservation area how that might influence the behavior and stress of the sheep that live in those different canyons. I was talking to Annie earlier. I'm really excited to share my research with people who might be familiar with this area. It's such an incredible area, and its context is pretty important for some of my results. So I'm really glad that some of you know exactly where I'm talking about and will probably recognize some of my photos, the locations of some of my photos. So my study area was this Dominguez-Escalante National Conservation Area, located between Grand Junction and Delta, Colorado. And there's lots of recreation in this area. There are 4 river access points to the Gunnison River, hundreds of kilometers of hiking trails and OHV roads, 2 developed campgrounds, endless dispersed camping opportunities. Recreation here includes OHV use, mountain biking, hiking, climbing and bouldering, horseback riding, backpacking, kayaking, rafting. I'm sure lots of other things people do out there as well. The desert bighorn sheep subherds, or these groups of these areas where the U groups would typically stay, are each exposed to differing types and intensities of recreation. Like so many of the public lands in the US, the Dominguez-Escalante is experiencing more recreation every year. This is a graph where here on the bottom, on the x-axis, we have the year, and on the y-axis, we have the value. In green, we have visitor days, or the amount of time people are spending, and in pink here, we have the number of visits, the number of people. In 2020, we're going to see a really continued increase in the number of visits and a pretty big spike in the visitor days or time spent in recreating in the area. And these drastic increases are largely attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic, but as you can see, we've seen continued increases since then. And we got these numbers because recreation is monitored by BLM with trail counters in select management areas. Then the data is input into formulas to calculate the annual use in these large general management areas of the conservation area. However, this data was too broad scale for me to use in my analysis. So I'll talk about what I did in a little bit here, which is this moment right now. So as I'm going to hammer on and continue saying, all of my objectives really hinge upon understanding the recreation at a small scale where they have a measurable impact on the bighorn sheep. It doesn't mean much to sheep if you draw a big circle over here and you say this recreation is high. What matters is, when is the recreation there? Where are the sheep relative to that recreation? How many people? Is it 1 every hour? Is it 20 in an hour? So this was really important that I get right. So from February 2021 to December 2022, I monitored recreation using 53 game cameras at intervals along the trail. And I and a whole bunch of helpful technicians counted the number of motorized and non-motorized recreators that went by for every trail segment. As for the bighorn sheep, we really needed to be able to individually identify each of the sheep, or at least some of the sheep, and we need to be able to find them. So to do this, we captured 48 adult females using this really cool method called helicopter net gunning. Each sheep was fitted with a GPS collar and a combination of uniquely colored ear tags, so I'd be able to tell them apart. And then during that same time period that I monitored the recreation, I conducted behavioral samples on these groups. We used high-powered optics like the spotting scope in the photo, and we observed groups who were not aware of the observer's presence. We didn't want to influence their behavior by them knowing we were there. So during these behavioral observations, we recorded the duration of foraging and vigilance behaviors during a 50-step foraging bout. What that means is we counted how many steps they took, and in that 50 steps, we counted, or we calculated how much time was spent foraging, eating, grazing, taking in food, just making sure that they're getting food in them and getting those calories in. And then we also recorded vigilance. There's a couple different types here. The first is exclusive vigilance, in which the animal was only vigilant. Think an animal whose ears and eyes are focused on a point, checking something out, saying, is that a mountain lion? Is that going to eat me? Is that coming for me? Do I need to be worried about that? Routine vigilance is the other type of vigilance. This is when the animal was multitasking. The animal was chewing, it had taken a bite of food, it was chewing, it was looking around. Maybe it wasn't focused intensively on something, maybe it was, but it is still able to help process the food and continue the digestion because it's chewing. And then the last type, or the sum of those two types of vigilance is considered the overall vigilance. And then to measure stress, I collected fresh fecal pellets, and we froze those samples and then freeze dried them, and then sent them off to the Smithsonian Institution, who did this great process called corticosterone radioimmunoassay, where they extracted the metabolites and gave us a measurement. So I could talk about my great complicated statistics and bore you all. Instead, I will glaze over them pretty quickly. If anyone has any specific questions, I'm more than happy to talk about them. But this probably isn't why you're here. This isn't the fun stuff. So generally what you should understand about my analysis is in order to understand how recreation affects a behavior, you also have to understand the other things that affect a behavior or a stress response, either way. And so the first thing I did was to create models that explain the behavior or the stress using the variables that the sheep are going to interact with on an everyday basis. So we have temporal variables. Think, let's go over to the next slide here. Oh, I don't have those on this slide. Okay, so temporal variables. Think the season. Sheep are going to behave differently in the spring versus the fall. The time of day, the diel period. They're going to behave differently in the morning versus in the afternoon versus at night. Also, I included group variables, such as presence of lambs in the group. If there are young, the sheep are likely to behave have different behaviors. And then terrain. Bighorn are really associated with steep habitats with lots of escape terrain, steep cliffs or steep terrain that they can run across really nimbly, but their predators probably can't get across quite as quick. So I used this modeling process where I tried to explain the response variable, the behavior or the stress, using all the things in a sheep's everyday life that would impact that variable. And then once I explained it, I added in recreation and saw how different types of recreation would change the response. And then the analytical methods for recreation were a little bit different. I converted the counts of recreation, so how many people walked by a camera in a certain time period. In order to get a good model to predict recreation, I had to convert it to just presence or absence of recreation during a time period. So I couldn't say whether there was 2 people or 20 people on the trail. I just was able to say, or I was just able to predict, are there people or are there not people? The behavior models I used, I was examining how foraging time is different, overall vigilance time, and then the proportion of time the sheep spend exclusively vigilant. That's that behavior where they are not processing any food, they're not chewing, they're looking at something to determine whether or not it's a threat. The recreation variables I used included distance to the nearest trail. The recreation count directly from that camera is how many people were on the trail segment nearest them in the last hour or during that hour. The presence of dogs also from that recreation count extracted from the cameras. I also was testing my recreation prediction Are there people, yes or no, on the trail based on my model results? I also looked at the elevation difference between the desert bighorn and the trail. Bighorn sheep are much more concerned about people or predators or anything when it comes in from above them. There's a really cool study that showed that people who approached bighorn sheep from above elicited faster heart rates in the sheep than if those same people came at the sheep from below. So that was something I thought would be important to look at in this context. And then lastly, one of the variables I tested was the number of trail segments visible to the sheep. Similarly, with stress, we've got distance to trail, and then this great little lumped count prediction and presence of dogs. Remember, I said that the stress hormone metabolites in the fecal pellets show a delayed response. So I wanted to take it into account the time between when the stress might have been elicited to when those feces were pooped out and we were collected them and would be able to measure the metabolites. So first, I'll talk about my results in the context of the recreation that I observed. On this figure, we have the total count of recreation on the y-axis, this axis over here. We have motorized in orange and non-motorized in green, and then we have season across the bottom. What we see for motorized recreation, we see pretty much consistent numbers across these 3 seasons with lower counts in the winter. And this is pretty much expected as snow and mud limits access to some of the trails, and those temperatures are colder and people might not want to be out on their little 4x4s in the chilly breeze. With non-motorized recreation here in green, we see the greatest counts by far in spring, and then with a distant second with fall. And this really makes sense in a desert climate where we're seeing more recreation in the shoulder seasons at these lower elevation areas. And as we get up into summer, we're seeing probably more people going up to those high elevation mountains instead. So that kind of talks just generally about some of the temporal differences I observed with the recreation, but we can also look spatially and see the difference. So these are going to be maps of motorized recreation. We're going to have summer on the left here and winter on the right. And with these lines, we're going to see lighter orange or red are lower recreation counts, and then darker red counts. Darker red colors are going to be higher counts of recreation. And so if we zoom in a little bit closer, if we look up here, this is Route 141 through Unaweed Canyon. On most of these trails, we see that as distance to trailhead increases, you're going to see lower recreation counts, which is more prominent in winter. Some of these trail segments that are in gray didn't even have appreciable use, and I excluded them. I essentially, for that season, said there's no recreation on this trail. Don't consider this trail when looking at the behavioral or stress response. We're just going to fully exclude this because there isn't enough recreation to consider it. Here again, the same map, but this is going to be for non-motorized recreation with spring on the left, summer on the right, and lower recreation counts in light green, higher recreation counts in dark green, and gray, again, not enough appreciable recreation to consider. So if we look a little bit closer, I really want to draw your attention here to Big Dominguez Canyon right in the middle. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. By far, this was the most heavily used non-motorized trail in the study area. In all seasons, it had an order of magnitude more use than any other trail in the study area. In the spring, you'll notice greater recreation counts farther from the trailhead, indicating that people are hiking farther, while in the summer desert temperatures, people aren't quite as motivated to hoof it farther up canyon. And this really matches with what we observed on the cameras, which is there was a higher proportion of backpackers in the spring than other seasons. Some of the other trails, like these up north here in Unaweep Canyon, we didn't see quite a difference between summer and or spring and summer. Oops, sorry about that. And based on what I observed on the cameras, I started to see some familiar faces coming up into these canyons, familiar faces with their dogs. And it seems kind of like these trails are a little bit more often used for exercise by Grand Junction locals because it's pretty quick and easy to access. While if you're going to go down here to Big Dominguez Canyon, it's a longer drive down a dirt road with lots of washboards. And that's probably people who are out looking for scenery and adventure and potentially willing to go a little bit farther. And so these really provide some good examples of factors you need to consider when quantifying recreation. And this is the sort of detail that can be lost when recreation is just categorized as high or low. I'm going to look at the time here, see how I'm doing. All right. So these figures will get really busy. I'm going to break them down for you. And again, we'll be happy to talk more specifically about statistics if people have questions, but I'll give you the general idea of what's going on. So this is the plot of odds ratios. So odds ratios are the likelihood of recreation being present. So that's going to be here on the x-axis at the bottom, with the y-axis having all of the different variables I tested in my predictive recreation models. A value of greater than 1 here in the odds ratio means the likelihood of recreation is greater, and then a value less than 1 means the likelihood of recreation is lower. So let's break this down here. For motorized recreation, in all seasons, it's less likely that there is motorized recreation in the morning and the evening relative to the middle of the day. That makes sense. That's when people typically get out and about. There's a greater likelihood of recreation on weekends than weekdays. Again, that makes sense. That's when people have spare time to get out. There's a lower likelihood of recreation as you get farther from the trailhead, and that effect is much greater in winter in blue there. Motorized recreation is more likely on warm days in the winter and cooler days in the summer. Again, a lot of this makes sense. And lastly, motorized recreation was less likely on days with more wind and on days when it precipitated. So here we have the same plot for non-motorized recreation. Again, in all seasons, there's a lower likelihood of recreation in the morning and the evening instead of the middle of the day, greater likelihood on weekends. Again, you're more likely to see recreation closer to the trailhead than you are farther from the trailhead. And that's what we saw illustrated in the map. At lower elevations or at higher elevations, you're less likely to see recreation. And then we have this seasonal difference of temperature or the effect of temperature that we really expect. In warmer temperatures, in spring and winter, you're more likely to have recreation. And then in cooler temperatures in the summer and fall, you're more likely to have recreation. And then we see that precipitation and wind dissuades non-motorized recreation in the winter. So all this really makes sense. And the results of my predictive model were that I was able to create a model that had pretty decent ability to predict the presence and absence of recreation. And that made me comfortable using this as a variable to examine stress and behavior. So looking at the results of my behavior analysis, over nearly 2 years, we conducted over 2,000 behavioral observations across these subherds, which totaled about 152 hours of observation time. And here's a great example of this female, this ewe, with her ear tags and her GPS collar, exhibiting some of our behaviors that we're looking for. Here's routine vigilance. She's got her head up, she's chewing, she's kind of looking around, seeing if everything seems to be safe, and here she's foraging again. Her head is lower, she can't see as well, but she needs to get those calories in order to survive. Here are my great Moore statistics plots here. These are called coefficient plots, and I'm going to kind of glaze over these a little quickly. Again, please feel free to ask questions. What we have is I've removed all of the other things that might affect behavior, and I'm focusing solely on the recreation results. In whatever's in blue will be the model that performed the best. In green, it will be the second performing model, and in red will be the third performing model. However, typically these models had similar performance. And the thing that you will notice on almost every one of these plots is that the base model ranked very highly. And what is the base model? The base model is the one that does not include any recreation variables, which I'll talk about what that means in a moment here. So here, a couple things to point out. With motorized recreation, we see greater foraging times, closer to trails when recreation is present. That doesn't make any sense. I'll explain why in a moment. And then again, that base model with no recreation still performs very highly. For non-motorized recreation, with these lines crossing the dotted line, we are not seeing a strong effect of these recreation variables, and that base model is performing really strongly. Again, we see this very similar for overall vigilance. We see no recreation variables performing very strongly. We do see a significant interaction here with non-motorized recreation, and this interaction term with dog presence and distance to trail. So this means in the presence of dogs, vigilance of the sheep is going to be greater when they're closer to the trail. And then as the distance to trail increases, the amount of vigilance will decrease, specifically in the presence when dogs are present on the trail. For exclusive vigilance, just that behavior where they're only vigilant, we see more effects of dogs a little bit, but we still have some overlapping here with the line at 0, so not particularly strong effects. So in summary, I observed non-significant effects. A lot of those lines crossed that dotted line at 0, but that doesn't necessarily mean that these results are non-trivial. And I'll get into that in a moment here. The other thing I wanted to show first is the similar figures, but specifically for stress response. With motorized recreation, we do see a significant relationship between trail count and in the previous 24 hours and the distance to trail. And here we do see significant results where the sum of the non-motorized recreation in the previous 4, 12, and 24 hours does have a significant positive relationship with the amount of stress observed in the sheep. So greater non-motorized recreation does increase physiological stress. So briefly, I'll talk about my recreation models, my recreation results. I found that recreation varies spatially and temporally within the study area, and this really indicates that lumping recreational usage into low and high without taking into account variables that cause variation, such as the time of day, the season, the weather conditions, whatever else, can really miss important detail of what animals are encountering when on the landscape. I was able to create models that accurately predicted presence and absence of recreation, but that wasn't really what I was trying to do. I was trying to create reliable predictions of the amount of recreation. Despite my best efforts, I wasn't able to do this, and that's because this study area doesn't get all that much recreation for the scale at which I was looking at it. Over 80% of the data, when I lumped the recreation counts into 3-hour chunks, not including the nighttime, even just including the daytime, over 80% of that data was zeros, and building an accurate statistical model with that kind of data is really, really difficult, and in my case was not possible. And I am optimistic that this modeling that I attempted would be possible in areas with greater recreation counts, somewhere like Colorado National Monument, which gets a lot more recreation than our hidden little gem of Dominguez-Escalante. And using that method could really reduce the cost and effort of otherwise really intensive monitoring at the scale at which I did. And the reason you're probably all here, what you want to hear, how does recreation influence behavior and stress of these desert bighorn sheep? The results revealed pretty starkly that greater levels of non-motorized recreation significantly increase stress levels in desert bighorn sheep. But for behavior, the overall non-significant effects suggest that there isn't a trade-off imposed by recreation in the study area at current recreation intensities, which are pretty relatively low if we think of the grand scheme of things. However, after my time out in the field collecting data, this isn't really a surprise to me. I believe that there's a couple main factors contributing to these non-significant but not non-trivial results. And the first is habituation. It is extremely apparent that these animals are habituated to human use throughout the study area. Even when I approached bighorn sheep groups to collect fecal samples, they didn't flee until I was within maybe like 100 yards. And I wouldn't really consider lazily getting up and wandering another 100 yards before they bed down. I wouldn't really consider that to be flight. I also saw some pretty scary habituation on Route 141 through Unaweep Canyon. Sometimes the bighorn forage directly beside or on the road with their butts over the white line, and they don't even look up when cars speed past at 500 miles, or if not 500 miles an hour, 50 miles an hour. Is this illustrated in a great way in this photo where the sheep is more concerned with the photographer than the car that is farther away than the car that is driving by. And this traffic was outside the scope of my research, but it's just a really good illustration of habituation, even with great risk, especially when there is great reward. Some areas had really high reward for the potential risks that bighorn could perceive to be associated with recreation or vehicle traffic. This is the lovely irrigated alfalfa field in Dad's Flat, and also the ones in Escalante Canyon are a really tasty reward for habituation. The bighorn frequently foraged in these fields and indeed spent a lot of their day in them, which is really uncommon to see bighorn spending time in flat vegetation in an area with some decent vegetation. The Dad's Flat subherd was pretty isolated from recreation, but Escalante Canyon Road runs right past the fields in that canyon, and it had the greatest motorized use in the study area, exposing the bighorn to lots of vehicles while they ate this green, delicious, crunchy alfalfa. And then another factor mitigating the effects of recreation was that the bighorn had ample space and opportunity to spatially separate themselves from exposure to humans. The trails, and especially the most heavily used ones in Big and Little Dominguez canyons, are located in those canyon bottoms and lined with very steep cliffs. And this creates few points for your average human to access more than a small area of the canyon bottom. And to kind of provide a context for how much area away from recreation is available to the sheep, when I was using my behavior data for the recreation, for testing the effects of recreation, I removed the sheep who were not able to see some amount of trail within 2 kilometers, about 1.25 miles. If they weren't able to see the trail, I didn't include them in the recreation analysis because recreation would not be affecting them. When I did that filtering, I lost over half my observations. Those sheep were just in places they couldn't see the trail. In this photo here, I've roughly drawn the Little Dominguez Canyon Trail. And everything in the canyon and uphill of it onto the mesas are accessible to the Bighorn. And it really provides some refugia for the sheep to leave the recreation corridors when they wanted to avoid it or if the disturbance got too bad. Lastly, the topography of the canyons restricted recreation to very predictable locations in these canyon bottoms. And a lot of other studies have shown that predictability reduces the impact of recreation on wildlife. So is it all good news? Can we build trails throughout the desert, throughout sheep habitat, and have plenty of recreational opportunities with no negative impacts? The good news is desert bighorn sheep can and do habituate to human use in some circumstances. However, areas with greater recreational use or less predictable use, areas without high quality forage as an effective reward for habituation, or areas providing less spatial refugia really need to be studied as recreation increases continue or before infrastructure is developed in these places. Although I believe many of my results may not be significant, they're also non-trivial because they indicate that in different circumstances, these effects can have significance with potential negative impacts on the bighorn. There's lots of more questions to answer still about this study system. Future analysis that we're hoping to work on will incorporate the GPS colored movement or the GPS color data to examine the movement patterns of these sheep as well as their habitat use. What I kind of expect to see is some spatial separation from recreation corridors, which would then kind of offset the need for changes in behavior, which is what I was looking for with this research so far. And I kind of expect this spatial avoidance to be more prominent during times that they're more sensitive to disturbance, such as during the lambing period when they're having their young. So thank you all for attending my presentation this evening. And this is a beautiful ram from the Escalante Canyon subherd. I'd like to just give a quick shout out and thanks to all the people who made this project possible, all the great funding sources, and all the great field technicians, photo processing techs. I had my field techs especially had pretty ceaseless enthusiasm in the pursuit of canyon adventures and rigorous data collection. So I really appreciate their hard work. So thank you all. That is the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions that may be in the chat.
Thank you, Ashley. It was fun seeing some recognizable locations in your pictures. I think many of us on the call have probably seen the bighorns down in the alfalfa fields in Escalante. That's probably one of the most reliable viewing spots we have around here.
Or the highway of Unaweeb Canyon in 141.
Yes,
that is
there too. I know I recently had a group sneak up on my group, actually. We were there climbing and then noticed a herd getting closer and closer. And then we heard all of them, I think, jumping over the guardrail when they crossed the highway. I think their hooves were hitting part of the guardrail. And so it was just this steady clink, clink, clink as they all hopped over. Yeah, well, please, folks, if you have any questions for Ashley, you can put those into the Q&A. I have the chat up as well if there's more comments, but send your questions into Q&A. We do have a couple questions more about some of the variables that you were looking at.
Yeah, great.
And data sources. So first question is just a term that was, I think, associated with a lot of the variables in your modeling. What is diel? D-I-E-L.
Great question. That's a word that you know what it means, you've just never heard it before. Diel means the time of day. So you could lump it in as simple as morning, night, day, afternoon. It could just be night and day. Specifically in my research, we're talking about 3 hours after sunrise is considered morning. Diel is that chunk in the middle of the day, the day is right in the middle of the day, and then evening is that 3 hours before sunset. So Bighorn sheep tend to be very diurnal. They tend to be awake during the day and active during the day, and they are not nocturnal. They tend to kind of post up somewhere where they feel safe overnight and don't move a whole lot. Um, so we're going to expect to see different behaviors in the morning and the evening when maybe they've been asleep and posted up all night and they're kind of hungry and they need to get some food in the morning. And then they can kind of take a nap during the day, forage as they want, and then they're going to forage a little bit more intensively in the evening before they're going to bed down for the night. And they've got lots of time to chew their cud. Um, so we're going to expect to see differences in stress and behavior at those times of day, and also potentially have different responses to the recreation at those times of day.
Great. We also have a question about your wind data. Where did you source it, and what is considered high wind versus low?
That's a great question. I pulled the weather data, I believe, from the airport in Grand Junction, which obviously isn't as close as you would hope for something like this, but it really was the only option. I think there's a weather station somewhere at a higher elevation part of the conservation area, but it wasn't reliable. It wasn't functional at all times, and in order to create these models, you need really consistent data. So I just kind of assumed that the weather would be comparable or at least relatively similar between the airport in Grand Junction and the study area. And I didn't classify high wind and low wind. I used the wind speed itself. So just what we saw was, I'd have to look at the results, but I think in winter motorized recreation on windier days, we saw less likely recreation. And that is just directly the wind speed. The higher the wind speed, the fewer people or the less likely there would be people out there.
Yeah, thanks.
Mhm.
Some more questions to then the results. And I'm going to kind of add on to this one. So the question itself is, did you observe a big difference in sheep reaction to hikers with dogs on leash versus off leash? And I think my continuation of that too is, what kind of comparison could you make between those reactions to, let's say, non-motorized recreation with dogs versus motorized recreation, and which ones seem to be affecting the sheep the most?
Yeah, I didn't differentiate in my analysis dogs who were on leash and off leash. We tried counting that on the cameras. It got kind of complicated. Sometimes leashes are hard to see in washed out game camera photos. Um, and the reason why I was comfortable just kind of lumping those together is that anecdotally, when I was out there looking at the sheep and doing my observations, the reaction to on leash and off leash dogs was very similar. And that is the thing that most notably the sheep were not happy about. They were much more vigilant, and in a couple instances, they just said, "We're out of here." And they were in the canyon bottom. Or near the canyon bottom, and they would just climb up those cliff bands up onto the mesa and be gone. And then your second question was about the difference in reaction to dogs versus motorized recreation. Yeah, one of the things about motorized recreation that I observed and that is recorded in a lot of other studies is that with other types of animals, not bighorn, because there isn't a ton of bighorn research in recreation. But one of the things is that predictable recreation is less disturbing, even if it's faster, even if it's louder. It tends people going by on bikes, bikes or motorized recreation, they're in and they're out and they're not going to see the sheep or the animals. They're just going to go right by. They're going to stay on the trail. While people on foot are a lot less predictable. They can cover a lot different terrain, and they're more likely to see the bighorn, and therefore they're more likely to approach to try and get that photo, to try and get that better look. And that's something that we kind of expect to see a difference in the sheep reactions. So I would, you know, from my experience out there, dogs are the most disturbing thing, while the motorized recreation tends to just go right by and the sheep say, hey, bye, and get to keep doing what they're doing.
Yeah, thank you. I think that sort of might contradict what some of the assumptions would be, but to your point, that predictability of and the habituation that you shared earlier, those sheep are so accustomed to people driving by that clearly, as evidenced by their presence right on the road, those motorized
And
uses don't seem to be as much of a deterrent.
And even when that motorized use stops to look at the sheep, um, the sheep typically don't react until someone gets out of the vehicle. That they know that that vehicle isn't going to veer off the road and come straight for them, but they're not sure about a person on foot because that person on foot is able to cover some different ground.
Yeah. Um, Getting into some anatomy, we have a question about sheep's stomachs. Could you talk a little bit about what their stomach anatomy is like? And you mentioned chewing cud earlier, so just how that foraging and their gastrointestinal system works.
Yeah, sure. That's not anything I've ever been asked before, but I can give you my general understanding. Bighorn sheep are in the family Bovidae. They're related to cows and other goats and sheep species all over. They're lumped in there with those other species. They are ruminants. They have that four-chambered stomach to simplify. When they are foraging, when they're eating, they're taking big gulps, they're taking big bites, and they're chewing it enough to get it down to swallow it. But they're not grinding it up into a nice, easy to digest chunk as they're stuffing their face. What they're going to do is they're going to wait until they're in a more safe location or they've got time to lay down, and they're going to bring that food back up from their rumen, from that first chamber of their stomach, and they're going to process it. They're going to chew it to be much more fine. And I believe the particles have to be a certain size. They have to be small enough in order to travel into the next stage of the front gut, the rumen, the stomach. And so it's really a strategy for a lot of species that I'm going to get in this food where it's probably less safe, but I'm going to fill my stomach and then I'll deal with making sure I can process that when I'm somewhere a little bit safer.
Great, thank you. Here's an interesting one. Did you find any sheep carcasses, and were you able to determine cause of mortality?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish I had pulled up my data. So we were monitoring the GPS collars for mortality signals, and we were going and investigating mortality whenever possible. I do know that just outside my study time, there were one or two animals that were hit on Route 141 and died. They were not my study areas or study animals, but I do know that is a cause of mortality in that herd. I had, I believe, three confirmed mountain lion kills during my study of specifically of my collared individuals. And then a really interesting mortality, which I believe was, I think, a bobcat attack on an adult ewe that the ewe didn't die right away. She ended up getting a pretty bad infection, and I watched her kind of go through it as she died of infection, which was pretty sad. Other sources of mortality in that herd are always with bighorn sheep. There's always the potential for slips and falls. It's not common, but they are in really risky terrain, and everybody has a bad day. Everybody takes a wrong step. I did have two animals who I observed with injuries, with leg injuries, where they were, moving around on three legs. One ewe in Unaweep Canyon, who I fondly called Gimpy, had a front leg issue where she was hobbling on three legs. Looking at her GPS collar data, I don't believe she was near the road between the time I saw her healthy and saw her hurt, so I don't think she was hit by a car. It's more likely that she fell. Um, and the great thing about Gimpy is she, as far as I could tell, raised a lamb to weaning that year. So she was a great ewe. Her GPS collar failed before the end of the study, so I'm not sure what ended up with her, but I didn't see her again over the winter. It's possible she wasn't able to survive the winter with the injury, but was able to survive the summer. So those are typically what we're going to see with mortality. I do know the other two causes of mortality with bighorn sheep that are a big concern are pneumonia, respiratory disease, which is transmitted from primarily domestic sheep, and that's why there's been a lot of conversion of domestic sheep grazing allotments in bighorn habitat to other types of grazing, typically cattle. Um, it's also why I was a little distressed to have camera photos of one day of a person walking their goats out on the trails. Please, this is my PSA. Please do not bring your goats hiking in bighorn habitat. It is not good for respiratory disease and could cause some really big problems. I also believe that there is some sort of mite that is going around. It's not mange, it's think it's scabies is the mite that has been observed in Escalante Canyon in recent years. So if you see sheep with patchy hair, that is something that may not necessarily kill them, but is a concern for Colorado Parks and Wildlife and something that they're monitoring out there.
Man, that I'm sure to watch all of this play out too as a researcher, it's tough because you can't, intervene when there was that you said who had maybe been attacked by a bobcat, but just having to watch it all play out. Some
Yeah.
interesting case studies though. And yeah, you had a picture, not just goats on the trail, but camels too, right?
Yeah, that was definitely the weirdest thing I saw on my photos.
Yeah.
Less distressing than the goats.
Well, we have a few more questions. I'm gonna save one for I think our last one, but you touched on this already just about predators present in the study area. So primarily mountain lions as well as bobcats. Do you find any other animals that are predating the sheep?
Um, Not that I'm aware of in this study area, but bighorn can be susceptible primarily to mountain lions. There's a really interesting video that was going around social media in the last few years of a coyote chasing down a ewe, which is not very common, but is certainly possible. Golden eagles have also been known to predate on some sheep. With coyotes, bobcats probably, and golden eagles, you're more likely to see predation on the young, on the lambs than the adults, but that's not to say that's not possible. And then the golden eagles will sometimes kind of swoop down on a sheep or a lamb that's on a cliff side and push it off the edge. So some really interesting strategies to get a meal out there.
Yeah, definitely. With collaring, you mentioned you only collared ewes, correct?
Mhm.
How many did you collar?
I wonder if I can find that really quick to give you a number. I believe it was 45
Hmm,
over the course of two captures.
wow. And then, so going back to, those, the threats of having domestic sheep and other animals around these wild bighorns, someone's asking if you saw any evidence of that M. ovi in sheep. So this infection, sorry, yeah, the infection.
Yeah, so MOV is the shorthand for Mycoplasma ovipneumoniae. It is bighorn sheep pneumonia. I can get into the more complexities of it. But unfortunately, Colorado Parks and Wildlife didn't want to test for MOV during my study. It has been known to be prevalent in the past. it was quite a relief to not see very many ill sheep in my study area during my study coming from the Mojave Desert. It's often, even after the infection has gone through the herd and we've had high mortality, sometimes it can stick around and infect the lambs every year. So I came from a system where I saw little adorable baby lambs coughing and hacking and struggling to get their breath, which is really, really tragic and really tough to do anything about. It's very tough to manage. Once it's in the system, there isn't a whole lot of recourse to get it out. But it was really nice to come to this system and not observe it. I don't know why that is. There, like I said, a lot of the domestic sheep grazing allotments have been converted, thanks to a lot of the work done by the Rocky Mountain Bighorn Society, and probably Wild Sheep Foundation as well. So that's really good for the sheep in the study area. But at this point, unless there's really, really good separation, and those goats wandering through the canyon are not great separation, it's always a matter of time before the infection, the pneumonia resurfaces.
Yeah. I'm gonna use this question as our last one, which is sort of just a reflection for you.
Okay.
Did the results of your study surprise you at all?
Um, No, a little bit, but no. And for all those reasons that I listed at the end, the habituation was pretty apparent. The spatial separation is fantastic. I was climbing up onto these mesas, and very rarely did I see footprints of other people. You recognize your own boot prints. Rarely did I see anybody else's boot prints out there, going into these places that only the sheep go. So it was frustrating not to find the big effect of recreation that I was searching for. It was frustrating in two ways. One, I am very worried that someone will take my results and say, look, sheep are fine. We can build trails wherever we want and send people out there, and that is absolutely not the case. Um, the other reason why it's frustrating is when it comes to statistics, if you don't find if you don't find an effect, it's either because there is no effect or because you asked the wrong question and tested the wrong thing and didn't examine the variables the right way. So finding no effect was meant that I had to do more testing and more altering of my statistical modeling and ask new questions and try and find it out. So while it was frustrating, it was a bit of a relief, and it was not much of a surprise. Um, and I'm looking forward to the results of our habitat selection or our habitat analysis, because I think that we'll see more of an effect at that level than we did when you're looking really close up at what is a sheep doing in the moment.
Yeah, and I think too, just given the patterns that you were noticing, I think we have some folks on this meeting who are going to take some key points away and be able to apply it in their volunteering with us, because that backpacking spike season that you mentioned. So Big Dominguez Canyon is seeing ever increasing recreation, and a real big surge of backpacking, and the impacts of that recreation are being felt. There's issues at the trailhead with parking. We have people not understanding the waste management system they are supposed to be following, building excess fire rings. The more foot traffic you have through there, the more people are probably going to start to maybe scamper up some of those cliffs and canyon sides to try and find their own unique area. But with that, in the spring season, when this activity is so high, I think trying to share that information that you've shared with us all tonight, we can all kind of take away from this presentation, urging folks to act predictably, give those sheep their space, consider, whether bringing your dog out to an area where sheep are going to be, whether that's really the best decision to make for these wildlife. Any other things, I guess, that you would just lastly add for anyone at an organization like this, or who is a volunteer who might be doing some outreach in that regard? What practical tips can we share with the public?
Yeah, recreation in this area is highest in the spring, and that tends to be when these bighorn sheep are the most sensitive. It's when they're having their lambs. It's when they're trying to find those really remote areas away from predators and away from people to make sure that they can have their lambs safely and raise them up. Um, I would uh, I would advocate that everyone follow leash laws, especially, and potentially leave your dog at home during those sensitive periods, or if you're going to be in bighorn habitat. And just remember that remember to keep your distance. It is such an incredible experience to have an encounter with a bighorn sheep, to see one up close, but approaching them is not necessarily the most responsible or considerate thing to do for the animal whose space you are entering and whose habitat you are going to enjoy. And even though it might seem like, oh, it's just me out here. Oh, it's just me looking at this sheep or getting close to this sheep. If everyone else does it as well, just like with everything else in, like, if everyone else does it, you're going to have a much bigger impact. So recreate responsibly, recreate safely, and please give the sheep some space.
Well, Ashley, thank you so much for sharing your research with us tonight, for equipping all of us with this information to take better care of these animals that call the National Conservation Areas home. And really for your contributions to the National Conservation Area. We're so appreciative of your time tonight for sharing your research. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We're going to have another lecture next week about beaver dam analogs and some active restoration projects that can be happening around here. So that's my quick plug for next week. But Ashley, thank you so much. And you'll all be getting an email with this lecture recording from me tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you, Annie. I really enjoyed it. It's great to share. It's great to share my results with people who know where I'm talking about. So I really
Definitely.
enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and thank you all. Have a great night.